Okay. Thanks again, everybody, for joining the call. I think we're going to go ahead now and get started. Yes, so welcome. Welcome everyone to this webinar in Jonglei State, hosted by the Small Arms Survey and its Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan. I am Christopher Carlson. I am a senior researcher at the Small Arms Survey and a project lead for several of the activities that we run out of our Nairobi office. Thanks again for all of you joining us today, and thank you very much to our panelists. They include my colleague at the Small Arms Survey, Ferenc Marko, and we're also delighted to have Pauline Eloff and Rob Lancaster here as well. They will each have a proper introduction in just a moment. If you haven't registered to access the Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan, you can do so on the project's homepage, and we will post a link in the chat box for any of you who would wish to access the website and see what we have going on there and access the over 700 profiles that we have on actors in South Sudan. And if you weren't already on our mailing list and you received this invitation from a colleague, perhaps, I've added your email to our mailing list based on that which you provided in your registration. So you can look out for announcements in the future for written briefs, website updates, webinars, and any other events that we may have. One upcoming webinar that we have in the works in a written brief, we'll take a look at the renewal of the arms embargo on South Sudan with some reflections on measuring South Sudan's progress on the 5 benchmarks outlined within Resolution 2577. No date yet for when that's going to happen, but again, please look out for an announcement that will be landing in your inbox. With regard to today's webinar, we will be recording it. It'll be available on the Small Arms Survey's YouTube channel, where you can find prior webinars that we have held on Unity and Upper Nile, among them. In addition, within the YouTube page, a whole assortment of other Small Arms Survey videos, including an ongoing webinar series that is hosted by our sister project, the Security Assessment in North Africa. Some interesting conversations there, touching on current dynamics in Libya, Chad, and weapons and explosives across North Africa and West Africa as well. So please check it out. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to today's panelists, please use the Q&A function, and your questions will be addressed following the panel discussion. Questions will remain anonymous, thus you won't be identified in real time, nor will the webinar recording identify who you are. So I hope everyone is feeling confident about that. And finally, I've asked the panelists to turn off their videos to minimize any burden that may be experienced among those of you who are calling in today from areas with slow connectivity. There will, however, be some slides within the opening presentation of Ferry's. So don't go completely into radio mode just yet, as we'll have some visuals there. And I think we're going to have a map anyway that we'll put up on the screen to assist with any references to various locations within Jonglei. I will now hand things over to my colleague Joshua Craze, contributing researcher to the Actors Mapping Project and author of several publications produced by the HSBA project on Sudan and South Sudan. And he will introduce today's topic and introduce our panelists. So thank you again for joining. Joshua, over to you.
Thank you, Christopher, for that excellent introduction. So just to explain, the reasons that the questions will be anonymous is you post them in the Q&A, and then I'll just read out the questions, but I won't read out any identifying information about who's posting it. So we've been doing this series on sort of taking a state in South Sudan and saying everything you need to know. So we previously did one on unity, and today the question is Jonglei. What is happening in Jonglei? What do we need to know about it? And they're designed to be sort of detailed, immersive exercises in trying to understand the political dynamics in a given state. And here today we have three experts with us who have individually forgotten more about Jonglei than I've ever known or will ever know. Ferenc Marko, who along with Christopher is the Einstein behind the South Sudan Actors and Alliance Mapping Project. He's been a researcher in South Sudan for 10 years, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with him for a number of years. So we're going to start with Ferry, and we're going to spend 15 or so, 20 minutes just sketching out why Jonglei is important, and there'll be some sort of rollout of that as a PDF text that will come out in the next couple of weeks. And then after that, we're going to shift to a panel discussion, and we're lucky enough to be joined by Rob Lancaster, who's the deputy team leader of the Peacebuilding Opportunities Fund, and he's been engaged in peace building in South Sudan on and off since 2013. And alongside Rob Lancaster, we have the spectacularly talented Pauline Eloff, who is the conflict and food security analyst for WFP, with 5 years work experience in South Sudan, and one of the most knowledgeable and smart people on Jonglei that I know. So I'm going to begin by turning to Ferry and just asking your starting opening question for 10, Ferry. Why is Jonglei important?
Thanks, Joshua. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think Jonglei, and now I'm speaking of greater Jonglei, so Jonglei and the GPAA. So whenever I will say Jonglei in this talk, I mostly will mean historic Jonglei or greater Jonglei, which includes or included the GPAA. And Jonglei state is the largest of the former 10 states, and according to the 2008 census, it is the most populous one as well. And also, according to a livestock survey done in 2011, just before independence, it hosts the largest herds and the largest number of cattle of all the states in South Sudan. And in a sense, Jonglei encapsulates everything from South Sudan that constitutes sometimes the problems, sometimes the amazing things in South Sudan. Jonglei hosts 3 ethnic communities. I mean, more than three large ethnic communities: Lower, the various sections of the Dinka Bor, and the Murle. And Jonglei has a shared history of warfare, but also a shared history of cooperation, inter-ethnic cooperation, and intermarriages. And I think it's both historically and it's worthwhile looking into. Also, the political economy of Jonglei is something that is can be used to see how the country is working on an economical level. If the communities in Jonglei can find ways to live harmoniously, we can be hopeful that South Sudan as a nation can follow suit as well. And the history of Jonglei is full with contradictions. The colonial government set up the first permanent bases around Bor, and the first missionary school and the missionary station was set up along the Nile. But on the other hand, the last quote-unquote pacification campaigns, and these are called euphemistically called pacification campaigns. These were very violent pacifications or military attacks on communities by the British colonial government. It also happened in Jonglei, and the very last territories that were conquered by the colonial authority are in Jonglei, mostly the Murle, but also the Lower were among the last ones who bowed to the rule of the British government. The SPLM was born in Jonglei in 1983. John Garang is from Jonglei. The first military success of the movement was in Jonglei, and the first permanently controlled territories by the SPLM were in Jonglei. So the administrative unit that we all know is named Boma, is named after Boma Mountains in Pibor, which is the ancestral land of the Highland Murle, which was the SPLM was able to capture and operate from it in the early 80s. And Jonglei also experienced a lot of violence and destruction in the last 100 years. The Nasir split had a profound effect on the local civilian population in 1991, and the most symbolic case is the Bor massacre, which has a permanent mark on the national psyche of South Sudan. And the civil war in 2013 also affected Jonglei massively. Bor town was captured and recaptured several times. And the first years of conflict, most of the battles were fought in Jonglei and Unity States, and partly in Upper Nile, but mostly in Jonglei State. And parts of Jonglei, especially the northern parts, so Akobo and the surrounding territories, mostly the Lower territories, are the only territories that the SPLA-IO was able to control throughout the entire civil war. And there's a kind of cyclical nature of violence in Jonglei as well. When the nation at large is experiencing more peaceful times, then violence sparks in Jonglei, and vice versa. When the wider country is in conflict, usually violence in Jonglei decreases. So the post-CPA came with extremely violent disarmament campaigns against mostly the Law Nuer and the Murle. These interventions resemble the British quote-unquote pacification campaigns, with militaries moving in and trying to disarm and punish the local communities. And interestingly enough, the GPAA, the Greater Pibor Administrative Area, which consists of Pibor and Pochala counties, is a very interesting experiment in South Sudan. It is seen as an example for a lot of the ethnic communities throughout the entire country. GPAA, as a result of a successful rebellion of David Yao Yao, is the first attempt to absolutize ethnicity and create an ethnic enclave, disregarding the colonial borders and the administrative divisions of the British colonial borders. The GPAA is a logical continuation of the way how South Sudan as a nation was imagined and built mostly on donor funding since the CPA and most profoundly since the Declaration of Independence. The GPAA is a model for a lot of ethnic communities. Some successfully argued, like the Padang Dinka in Ruveng. Some are not yet successful, like the Shilluk or the Jurlo in Western Bahr el Ghazal, or Kuku in Central Equatoria. That it is a case of ethnic self-rule, that it is an absolutization of ethnicity, that ethnicity should have the possibility to rule themselves freely. Obviously, this is not the case with the GPA, but this is how the GPA is imagined for a lot of people in South Sudan. And I don't think that the GPA as a self-governing ethnic enclave is the best solution for the Murle at large. And I think that, and we discussed this issue in the last seminar, that fragmentation of power or central power into smaller ethnic units is only a way for the central government to achieve greater control over the peripheries, mostly through violence, mostly through armed forces, mostly through ethnic militias. And seeing the big picture, I think the entire idea of self-governing ethnic communities is honestly a terrible future for South Sudan. Basically the end of the road in the absolutization and fetishization of ethnicity. And it's very hard to imagine, coming back from that. And I think the GPA is the reason why Salva Kiir was able to do the 28, later on 32 state decree, why it proved to be successful, because there was a case of an ethnic self-rule that could be followed suit by the creation of mostly ethnic states all across South Sudan. And the GPA also served as a role model for political constituency building. It propelled David Yao Yao to national importance, and several of his commanders are now mostly in Juba, within the cabinet of the National Unity government on different sides of the political divide. And also several of the commanders who fought against David Yao Yao are propelled into national importance as well. Case in the point is Stefan Marshal Babanan, a relatively unknown military commander of the SSPDF, who 2 days ago became chief of the military intelligence, one of the most important political positions in the country, with a control over a force that might be the second most potent fighting force of the country after the NSS, because the previous chief of the military intelligence, Rintu Mabor, was moved to be the governor of Lake States 2 days ago, and Marshal Stefan Babanan received this position. So I think in a nutshell, I will stop here answering this question, but in a nutshell, I think these are some of the issues why Jonglei is important and why we should look at Jonglei.
Thanks, Ferry. It sounds like there's enough for a book there. So if we bookend the question of the GPAA for a second, let's just bring Jonglei State up to date. What's happened in the last year, and especially what's led up to the nomination of the governor and the deputy governor?
Yes, thanks. Here in the picture, we see the deputy governor on the right and the governor on the left. Deputy governor is Antipas Nyokucha, and the governor is Denai Jok Chagor. Denai Jok Chagor is the governor from SOA, the South Sudan Opposition Alliance. Within SOA, he is representing SSUM, the South Sudan United Movement, which is the movement of late Peter Gadet. And Antipas Nyok is from SPLM. And And I think the case of the governor, Denai Chagor on the left, it's an interesting case, as he tries to go against the above described absolute ethnic politics that I described with the GPAA, and which is the rule of thumb in South Sudan, especially since the outbreak of the civil war. Mostly because Denai lacks ethnic support. That's why he's trying something else. But I still think we can learn a lot about South Sudanese politics by observing what is going on in the state and what will and is happening with Denai. And it is also a testing ground of how far the SPLM as a party, especially as a party from Juba, as a political party, the top echelons of the party from Juba can go and push their agendas in opposition-controlled states by appointing party cadres into deputy governorships, who then try to control local political space with an iron fist. We are seeing this in every opposition-controlled state. So Jonglei is not the only one. We discussed a lot James Tormoni Buni last week or a few weeks ago. In Western Baragaza, we have the same case. In Western Equatoria, we have a very similar situation. And in Jonglei as well. But I start with the governor. So Denai Chagor is the youngest of all the governors, and he's a political outsider who navigated the turbulent times of opposition and opposition outside of IO. So he is not IO, but SSOS, South Sudan Opposition Alliance, during the peace talks and after the signing of the RCSS. He established himself as a player in the field that ultimately resulted in his appointment as governor of Jonglei. Last year, however, have seen the gradual isolation of him. Although Denai is a lone nuer from Dengjok Payam in Akobo County, he lacks any meaningful political support in his home areas and regarded to be a government sellout, despite of being a member of the South Sudan Opposition Alliance. He also remained a political lightweight in the struggle for political power and political survival between various cliques of very influential Dinka Bor, SPLM veterans, and SSPDF military commanders. I'm thinking of people like Kual Manyang Yug, the former Minister of Defense, Gabriel Jokriak, who is the former Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, or Michael McCoy-Luet, who is the Minister of Information. And then I was nominated by SOA as the chairman of late Peter Gadet movement, the South Sudan United movement, a role he inherited after the sudden passing of General Gadet in April 2019. And we know that SSUM was only active in unity state. Denai Chagor was detached from South Sudanese politics as he lived in the United States before, but he was also detached from Jonglei politics as he joined SSUM and was helping Peter Gadet. Peter Gadet married Denai's elder sister and invited the educated and charming Denai to return from the US to take up the role of his personal secretary and translator. And Denai masterfully navigated this political landscape of Juba following the death of his mentor. First, he grabbed the docket of higher education that he later swept to the governorship. He was unable to turn the tide and use the opportunity in Jonglei to enhance his political constituency. His diminishing influence shows the limits of non-ethnic politics in South Sudan, especially far away from the capital and outside of the dominant SPLM-IG. One example is when Salva Kiir visited Bor in April 2021. It offered a rare opportunity for the governor to position himself as a bridge between ethnic communities and political generations. However, throughout the visit, the governor was disregarded by the president, which was painstakingly obvious when Salva Kiir delivered his address to the crowd in Dinka. So Denai Chagor was standing there listening to his president, who was joking with the crowd, sometimes joking on him in Dinka that Denai Chagor could not understand. And I think Rob and Pauline can tell us more about the reasons why it happened this way, but Denai Chagor also remained ineffective and invisible in the reconciliation talks following the spike of violence in 2020 between various ethnic communities in Jonglei and the GPAA. The government initiative was led by Vice President James Wane Iga, while the international community is working with local government and traditional and spiritual leadership structures. So Denai never presented himself as a peacemaker in this space. He have not used this opportunity as well. And going to the deputy governor, but the governor is isolated and facing the risk of removal, which I will talk about a bit. This did not result in the empowerment of his deputy governor. Salva Kiir appointed Antipas Nyok as a deputy governor in February 2021. Antipas Nyok served the SPLM-IG in various capacities since 2005. First, he was the SPLM Secretary of State in Jonglei. followed by 6 years in the party headquarters as an SPLM deputy secretary for political affairs, mobilization, and moral orientation until 2014. And he was originally supported by the Dinka Bor SPLM elites, the persons I mentioned, like Kolmanyang Yuk and Michael Makalue. He became quickly isolated within the local SPLM as he tried to transform the local party structures and try to grab the SPLM power on the pretext that he is building the party for a possible future elections. And the first sign of this tension between various party cadres within the SPLM in Jonglei became obvious when they could not agree on the nomination of a Bor South County commissioner. Every other county in the with the exception of the counties within the special administrative areas, receive their commissioners. The only exception is Makal/Malakal, that we discussed why, and Bor. And sensing this growing tension between Antipas Nyok and the SPLM veterans, Denai Jokchagor, the governor, did something, I think, very smart tactical maneuvering by appointing Dr. Agot Ali Erlik as mayor of Bor town in April 2021. The issue of the controversial appointment of mayors of main urban centers is a countrywide pattern. So I'm showing this map. I will discuss tell a few things about this. So in this map, what you see, this is the county commissionership distribution based on the RRCSS and the follow-up distribution of political positions agreement. Red is IO, blue is IG, green is SOA, yellow is OPP. And what you see is that in major so counties where you have major towns, the commissionership was easily given to somebody who is not from the same party as the governor, because I think the governors thought that, okay, I don't mind who is the county commissioner. What is important is the mayor that I will empower, that will work for me, and I disregard what happening. So Juba is green. That's a SOA commissioner in an IG captured state. In Capoeira North, you have an OPP and an IO commissioner in Torit and Capoeira, and in Vau you have an IG commissioner in an IO state, etc., etc. It's almost every country in the 9 from the 10 or 12 from the 13 follows this case. And Dr. Agot, who was appointed by Denai, is a member of the SPLM, is a long-standing ally of Kolmanyang, and one of the Dinka Bor veterans of the SPLM, and he's a former deputy and sometimes acting governor of Jonglei State. And with elevating an established member of the Dinka Bor community, the governor created further tensions within the SPLM, and the deputy governor reacted with uncontrolled anger. Antipas Nyok, as an interim chairperson of the Jonglei SPLM, dismissed Agot Alier from the party and from his position as mayor of Bor. He argued that if he is dismissed from the party, then he's losing his position automatically. And Governor Denai, smilingly said that, okay, I don't care about party structures, I don't care about internal party matters, you can fire him, but I hired him to be Bor mayor as a person, and he's still Bor mayor. And there was nothing to do for Antipas Nyok. The thing he did is that he arrested 37 SPLM members, so his own SPLM members, for a day or two before they got released, because they argued for Agot Alier, and they argued that he's overplaying his hands. So most of the elites in the Dinka Bor elites are calling for the removal of the deputy governor. And okay, I stop here before we go further.
Thanks, Ferry. So do you want to give us a brief prognosis for what you think will happen to Denai? Will he be able to continue to work in Jonglei? Will he be able to coordinate with his cabinet? What's the situation for him now?
Yeah. Let me get back here. I don't know what will happen to Denai, and I don't know what will happen to Antipas, but things are not looking good for them. That's for sure. And I think what will happen, what I can imagine will happen is the removal of the governor pretty soon, which might also lead to the removal of the deputy governor. On the 25th of May, fighting broke out in Muom. which is a cantonment site in Unity, far away from Jonglei. For a while, nobody knew what's going on, but then it turned out that these are SSUM forces, partly loyal to Denai Chagor, partly loyal to the chief of staff of SSUM, General Julius Mai. And what happened is that Denai Jok Chagor basically willingly gave up his armed forces for political support from the Montuil brothers. Part of them, Bapin Montuil, is part of SOA. Gwen Montuil is IG, he's the governor. And this also shows that Denai Chagor is in a terrible position. I mean, when you have to give up the only meaningful armed element that might support you, that you know that things are not looking good for you. On the 27th of May, after this was done by Denai and his forces, and they disarmed the forces of Julius Mai, the Leadership Council of SSUM wrote an appeal for the removal of Denai Jok, and they called the president to appoint a new SSUM governor for Jonglei State. So his very own party turned against him. And this letter was signed by 92 members. I had no clue that SSUM has 92 members, including military commanders, chiefs, elders, women, and youth representatives, mostly from Unity, but also from Jonglei. And the letter was also not just addressed to Salva Kiir, but with the political leaders of SOA as well. And it's unclear if the embattled governor can survive this coordinated political attack. However, then I cannot count on the support of fellow SOA leaders, as neither, I mean, any of them would willingly come and support the governor. I mean, it shows also that SOA is basically just a patchwork of individual egos, where they do not coordinate and they do not work together. So Vice President Hussein Abdabagi, or people like Josephine Lagu, Lam Akol, Joseph Bakosoro, or Gabriel Changson, they have no interest in helping Denai Chagor in political survival. And as a warning sign for the government, a few days later and a few days ago, SOA leaders reiterated this appeal, and they cited nepotism, they cited corruption, they cited lack of vision and failure of leadership from Denai, and asked the president to remove the governor. So it seems like a dead end for the governor. So this happened 10 days ago, so I'm unsure how long he can keep his position. But seeing that Salva Kiir removed the governor of Lakes and the chief administrators, both in Ruveng and in the GPAA, because they were unable to increase security and stop raiding, I think things are not looking good for Denai.
So let's move down to the GPAA. What's happened to Joshua Kony?
Yeah, I think Rob will be able to tell us a lot, because he and Pauline as well, because they spent substantial time in the GPAA. But not only Jonglei experienced intentionally weak and fragmented political authority and political space, but the GPAA as well. Salva Kiir released Major General Joshua Kony, who was the chief administrator of Greater Pibor Administrative Area, the GPAA, in early June 2021, so a few days ago. Joshua Kony is a former military commander and county commissioner of Pibor. He only served for 12 months in this position. And he was appointed in the height of the intercommunal violence in Jonglei and the GPAA between Lonuer, Bordinka, and the Morle communities. He promised to curb violence, and he promised to support the peace initiative. He did support the peace initiative. I'm very curious about Pauline's and Rob's take on him. He supported the peace initiative. Nevertheless, Morle attacks continued. These are low-scale attacks. These are not major military operations. These are small bands of, as Joshua Kony called them, Morle criminals, raiding neighboring communities. Nevertheless, it happened, which provoked a counter attack from the governor. We can discuss if this was revenge, as you know, if we can rightfully use the word revenge for an attack like that. But nevertheless, fighting seemed to be taken up again. And so during his short-lived reign, he failed to appoint a local government, he failed to appoint county commissioners, and he tried to win the cooperation of local youth by arguing that any further raiding will result in widespread destruction within the GPAA by revenging Lonuer, Bornuer, or Gavarnuer armed youth, supported by IO, supported by SSPDF militaries. And these tactics worked for a while. He lacked a strong political militia to enforce his will. He lacked SSPDF support on the ground. The the once strong SSPDF in Pibor is nothing compared to his former height. And Salva Kiir, because Salva Kiir reorganized the former Eagle Battalion in June 2020, moving out from the legal jurisdiction of SSPDF Division 8 in Bor. I don't want to get lost in details, but the battle-hardened former Cobra fighters of Yao Yao remained outside of the GPAA. They are the best soldiers of the GPAA. They remained outside. They are in training near Juba, and they will be, at one point, became part of the necessary unified forces of South Sudan once they graduate the forces. So Joshua Kony was removed, and as Diana Felix da Costa, who is a preeminent scholar of the Murle, she argued in a report published by the Rift Valley Institute that most successful leaders are able to combine, most successful leaders among the Murle are able to combine both spiritual powers with other sources of authority. And Ismail Kony, the recently passed away Ismail Kony, and David Yao Yao combined these qualities and thus commanded a great deal of respect among Murle age sets. Joshua Kony was unable to do so. The recently passed away Ismail Kony served as the Red Chief of the community, while he was also a very successful military commander on his own. David Yao Yao not just studied theology, so he spoke the language of spiritual authority, but also hails from a family of Red Chiefs. And the incoming chief administrator appointed by Salva Kiir a few days ago, locally Ame Bullen, is not just a military veteran with a university degree, but the son of an important chief and the brother of Nikcho Ame, who is the paramount chief, Red Chief of Pibor. He's one of the most influential customary leaders of the GPAA. I think he is very much part of the PRA peace process that we will talk about momentarily in a few minutes. So I think that's the case for Pibor.
Fantastic, thank you, Ferry. Maybe we'll move now to the panel discussion with all three of you. But I might just ask Ferry to begin the first question, which is this is a difficult question to answer succinctly, but I'm going to ask you all to answer it succinctly, maybe starting with Ferry and then going to Pauline. What happened in Jonglei in 2020? How would you characterize the nature of the violence? So when there's been a peace process this year, what is it addressing? What's the type of event that we saw in 2020 in Jonglei? Ferry, over to you for the first.
Thanks, Joshua. I don't want to get lost in the concrete chain of events because it's well researched and published. There are reports by the Human Rights Division of the UNMISS, and there are reports of the UN Panel of Experts. But just very in a nutshell, 3 waves of violence followed each other, starting with the Lone Nuer and Dinka attack on Likuangole in early 2020, followed by a Murle counterattack in May on Pieri, and finally a sustained military operation by Gavar and Nuer and Bordinka with the support of SSPDF, weapons and logistics, deep into the GPAA, which lasted for months. So it was a major military operation, not just a cattle raiding. And this wave was later joined of opportunistic Lone Nuer forces on a second attack on Likuangole. So hundreds of thousands of cattle had been raided from all communities, and almost 1,000 people got killed officially. But obviously, we don't know how many people got killed. The unofficial numbers are much higher than the 1,000 that is mentioned by the Human Rights Division of UNMISS. And I think what happened in Jonglei is that every community in Jonglei feel marginalized, and they feel marginalized legitimately. And the result of violence and unmitigated effects of the historic flooding in 2020 increased food insecurity. I think Pauline will talk about this. And in certain parts of Greater Jonglei, especially in Murle majority places like Gumuruk or Likuangole or Vertet, even Pibor, it reached famine-like levels. More people are in need of humanitarian assistance in Jonglei and in the GPAA than ever before since independence. Nevertheless, communities engage in violence against each other instead of realizing the common grievances that could connect and unite them. And members of the political and military elites in Juba, and nevertheless, if they are SPLM or SPLA-IO, are interested in keeping this status quo. Exploited populations on the peripheries do not forge alliances against the very elites, but identify themselves along ethnic lines and fight wars against each other. And the most heated debate about the 2020 violence is the categorization of contemporary violence in Jonglei. And there are 2 explanations. seems to drive the discussion. One, it's intercommunal violence committed by autonomous youth groups, or it is elite-driven political violence waged by instrumentalized militia and instrumentalized youth. And I think both these single narrative arguments are simplifications of very complex processes. Local residents in Jonglei see the issue in a much more complex way, violence in its entire complexity. For local people, the force of the government and raiding are not mutually exclusive categories, but simultaneously processes that induce or help each other. Raiding might be more successful if it meets the military strategy of the government or the military strategy of the IO. And elite manipulation is not a one-way street, but self-defense militias accept support if it potentially leads to a more successful raiding opportunity. And I call out Pauline here. Or I mean, I will praise Pauline here because several humanitarian organizations recognize this complexity and decided to adjust their terminology, moving away from generic and frequently problematic labels like cattle raiding, revenge, intercommunal violence, in order to better understand how violence diverse subnational conflict dynamics and how the interactions with political processes, linkages to the state, and what are the impacts on civilians. And once I finish in a minute, I really would like to hear Pauline on this and why she was part of this group that decided to try to adjust terminology and suggest a new terminology for organizations. So I would like to stop here. I just argued that the 2020 violence was organized and that most of the groups involved, especially the Luo Nuer White Army, the Bordinka Gelvangs, has the pattern of organization and a very clear chain of command that can be studied and can be analyzed if we are not lazy. Just for example, here is a schematic picture of the Luo Nuer White Army's command structure. And this is just the Goon section. This is the Mon section. This is the Gelvang, Dinka, Bor, Gelvang leadership structure. I stop here. I call on for the others. I go back to the map that we can all watch.
Great, thanks, Ferry. So Pauline, over to you. Was this intercommunal violence or was this elite-driven violence created by the GPAA elite, or are all our terms wrong?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Ferry. I think neither of those are true. And I think just to answer Ferry's question before I go on to your initial question, the reason why together with OCHA and the CSRF, WFP kind of spearheaded this process of changing the way we talk about violence in South Sudan is because it's so often it's not as easy to say as this is purely political, or as UNMISS would say, sometimes it's apolitical, or as a lot of humanitarians or even the government would say that this is purely communal and that these are, or that even worse, that these are resource-based conflicts. Quite often it's far more complex than that. And I think particularly since the peace deal was signed in 2018, what we've seen is this proliferation of violence and organized violence that, as Ferry rightfully mentioned, has all the elements of what normally you would describe as a non-international armed conflict. It meets the levels of intensity, it meets the levels of organization, and yet we can't call it an armed conflict because the armed groups that are involved don't have laid territorial claims against the government, are not trying to overthrow the government. And so because of that, we fall kind of in a gap. And I think particularly for WFP, for example, last year, this became very apparent that when FuseNet, which is essentially the international watchdog that looks out for famine or famine situations across the world, they came out with a position paper back in June saying that because the violence in Jonglei of 2020 that had been witnessed in February, March, and up until June was communal of nature, the risk of famine was reduced compared to the violence that Jonglei had seen in 2018 and before. And as we all know, that with the famine likely declaration that did take place in 2020 or December 2020, this was absolutely untrue. And I think we therefore missed an opportunity to have any kind of early warning because us as humanitarians, but also the international community as a whole, we see communal violence as somehow being between a bunch of boys running around with spears, fighting over cattle just to be able to pay for their dowries. Now, as everyone that works in South Sudan knows, that's simply just not true. It's not how the conflict is. And so what we decided then to do, a subgroup was set up, a technical working group was set up to discuss how and why we label violence. And really the violence that the terminology that we proposed is not actually the point of the document that we drafted. The document that we drafted was not about forcing people to use localized or subnational violence rather than communal violence. the document was essentially trying to force people to think about how they analyze and look at the violence that is taking place. And so what we try to ask people is to look at the objectives of violence, whether they're national, subnational, local, or even completely grassroots, to look at the forms of and targeting of violence that was being used, who is being targeted. Certainly, I mean, we can't call the Pieri attack of 16 May last year a cattle raid. 70 across a stretch of 70 kilometers, multiple villages were attacked within a 12-hour period. It was a highly coordinated raid. Not a single cow was stolen, according to my understanding of that attack. And the civilian death rate was extraordinarily high. So to call that a cattle raid really just goes, yeah, is a complete misconception of what was taking place there. Similarly, the attacks in during the offensives of July and August were not just cattle raids. Of course, yes, the targeting did look at or did focus on the Nanam, Yom, and Baz pastures, but that has to do with a lot of other things, not just about it being about cattle raids. We also have to take into consideration the enormous extent of wetlands that was the result of the 2019 floods that we saw again in 2020, with a lot of the dry season pastures remaining flooded throughout the dry season in Greater Akobo, Uror, along the Duk Ridge, all the way up to Ayod. And so cattle keepers having to look for alternative pasture areas. Now that brings me, I guess, to my second point, or just to answer Josh's question around what is the nature of the conflict. And I think, Ferry has really set it out very well, kind of the political and the social scope of the violence. But what is often forgotten is the geographic scope of the violence. And in that, I think what is quite problematic is that people will often say, oh, this is a resource-based conflict. It's about cattle, it's about pasture, it's about access to resources. And really, I don't think that's true. I think the conflict in Jonglei is a product of entrenched physical, social, economic, political, etc., isolation and inequity. And so underlying this contemporary and legacy political splits that Ferry just discussed, these areas where we see this high level of violence and where we have seen these high levels of violence are also the areas facing the highest levels of physical and food insecurity, and are also at the same time the areas that are most physically isolated in South Sudan. In Jonglei, in central southern Jonglei, the failure of a single bridge during the rainy season severs the only functional road link for a third of Jonglei's population. This is really important to understand. These populations are hemmed in almost on all sides by rivers and wetland systems and are therefore exposed enormously to climatic shocks. Now, the results of those climatic shocks also impacts how their food security works and how their livelihood security works. If they lose their mobility, if they lose their ability to move every half year towards the relatively permanent wetland settlements, or to move to the temporary dry season cattle camps, it essentially requires them to make a decision between their physical security and their food security. And I think this is something that Rob can talk about a little bit more. But one of the things that has come back consistently in kind of the post-Pieri talks is, okay, sure, yes, we'll stop fighting, that's fine, but what else? What else do we have? We don't have livelihood options. We don't have mobility anymore because of the floods and because of the persistent insecurity in the area. And so I think, just to stop here and not continue for too long, I think if we don't take into account this entrenched inequity and isolation faced by these populations, then there's no way for us to really deal with the conflict and to really address these issues in a sustainable manner.
Thanks, Pauline. That was fantastic. Rob, are you on? And if so, would you like to add anything to that? It seems like Rob has some connection problems at the moment, so I will return to him shortly. Ferry, would you just like to sketch out briefly for us what's been happening this year? What is a peace process? What is the Pieri peace process? And how's it been going so far? Ferry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I was unsure if you asked the question to me because I'm not really involved in the Pieri peace process. So I hope Rob will come back and he can enlighten us on this. I don't know if Rob is around to answer the question, or
I'm back now, sorry.
Oh, good.
Okay, great. you want to lead us off on the PRA peace process?
Yeah, sure. I guess in very summary form, sorry, I missed the last part of what Pauline was sharing, but in summary form, what we were looking for was whether, in fact, initially there was any opening entry point into some sort of peace process following the severity of the violence last year. And so what has become this process began as an exploration, first in Juba in relation to the authorizing environment, and then on the ground to see what the possibilities were. And I think the approach has been what's described in one article as a kind of positive opportunism. So there, at a certain point in the process, there was a meeting with the spiritual leader Dakweth on the Lonuer side, at which he asked for Bachok Lal, the Red Chief spiritual leader on the Murle side, to come and visit him within 5 days, he said. And we couldn't quite manage that. But 10 days later, and in fact, Bachok Lal wasn't able to make it, but a Murle delegation, and this was on the 10th of December, visited Pieri, and there was a spear ceremony presided over by Dakweth to launch this phase of the process. And obviously there have been various attempts over the years in Jonglei, so there's no guarantees around anything. And since that initial point, it's really been a process of maintaining a sustained engagement, iterating rapidly around each step of the process, and grounding it as much as possible in the community's approach to addressing the peace, and particularly through the direct engagement of some of the key armed youth leadership that Ferry shared on one of his slides. And so linking this back to an earlier part of the discussion, it raises this question of how to mitigate some of those effects of the Juba elite. And what we found very early on in the process was that there was an increasing awareness by the armed youth leaders themselves and the community more broadly that to some degree, they were being instrumentalized by the Juba elites, and a very explicit request that the Juba elites be kept at a distance from the process in the first phases. So that's how it all began. And as it's unfolded, it's really emphasized also how to open up as many direct channels of communication and opportunities for them to connect face to face between the three communities, noting also that there's not just the higher level dynamics which can come in and influence it, but the general mutual suspicion. So when you get something that seems to be launching off between, say, the Murle and the Lonuer, that can be perceived in a different way on the Dinka Boer. So there's a little bit of a dance to be done to ensure that everyone is feeling included. Which also speaks to this point, and I would underline of what Ferry said around the sense among all communities in Jonglei of the feeling of marginalization. And so there's a kind of indignity that seems to be felt in all these communities, and a process that is oriented around them is one of the building blocks of something that perhaps can be sustained in a way that earlier processes haven't so much managed to, but if it is with a decent dose of luck along the way. There's some of the points that have sort of characterized it.
Great, thank you, Rob. Pauline, do you want to add anything to that? Because I know you were on the ground during some of that process. How did the actual peace process go? What happened at the peace conference?
I was on the ground. I don't think I can do a better job than Rob in explaining. I think he already has done a great job of explaining. I think, and I mean, this is something that I have also discussed.
Pauline seems to have temporarily vanished. Ferry, do you have anything to add to what Rob said there? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question.
Not really, no.
Okay, so Rob, going back to you, how's it, like, what's happened to the peace process? Has it broken down? Has there been violence subsequent to it? How are we to evaluate its relative success?
So I think we would approach it not in terms of talking about whether it's succeeded or failed, but as whether it's kept above a certain kind of watermark in terms of it being nourished, if you like. So a lot, and in that light, a lot has been made, obviously, and quite rightly, of the Gawer attack that happened recently. It's probably worth putting that in light of the counterfactual or a possible counterfactual. And the very clear sense we have from the engagements on the ground is that without this process and the relative confidence that it's managed to build over the last 6 months, there are at least 2 or 3 points where earlier where there would have been a mass mobilization that wouldn't have just been the Gawer, it would have been the Lonuer, Dinka Boer, and potentially Gawer as well. And one of the features of the Gawer attack was that Makwach, the spiritual leader Makwach, and it's often less emphasized his own particular interests in launching this attack, was actually very confident moving down from Ayod that along the way, as he moved through Duk and Uror, that people would jump on the bandwagon of the attack. And it was a bit, we gather to his surprise, that there was a real will on the Duk and Uror side to, at the very least, not to join the attack, if not to resist it. So yes, there have been obstacles, and there will continue to be obstacles. And the sporadic attacks that Ferry was also alluding to as some of what the former chief administrator was finding it difficult to bring under control. They're the real kind of thorn in the side of the process. Interestingly, when you talk to the Lonuer armed youth on the other side, they're starting to see some of the cost-benefit analysis. So it's coming into the narrative a bit, despite the ongoing attacks, where they're saying, well, look, yes, there are these ongoing attacks happening, but if we set it against our losses last year, because it's, and they talk in terms of, we lost more people from snake bites on the offensive last year than we have from sporadic Murley attacks this year. And we missed our opportunity to cultivate. And we've started to get these abductees who have been returned. And that's a feature of the process that's quite interesting. And the extent to which the return of those abductees are really perceived as a concrete peace dividend by the communities, including the more general youth, not just by women and so forth. So with all that in mind, you're starting to see a greater tolerance, if you like, for some of the events which in other circumstances might have provoked a full-scale mobilization. So, but the key here, we believe anyway, or one of the keys, is the sustained engagement. That it's not about these events, it's not about the Pieri conference, it's not about that spear ceremony in December, and it's not about what's just happened in Pibor. It's about the continual engagement in between, and finding ways to keep opening up those channels of communication directly when they look like closing down and retreating back into a preparation for a mobilization.
That's great, Rob. That's really clear. Can I encourage our attendees to put their questions in the Q&A, because we will shift to your questions in about 3 or 4 minutes. I think it's important to come to those. Ferry, do you have anything to add there on the place of the state government in the violence in the last year and in the peace process, coming back to the subject of your initial presentation?
Yeah, I think it's just important. It's just interesting to see that on the one hand, Joshua Kony, but Rob can correct me if he was on the ground. But on the one hand, it seemed like Joshua Kony really tried to jump on this, and also some of the county commissioners, maybe because they were more close to their ethnic constituencies and they really needed the local support. And I think the peace process is a very popular process on the ground. So that's why maybe these politicians who are keen on keeping their constituencies were supportive. While on the other hand, I have not seen that from Dinka Boer elites. I have not seen that from the governor of Jonglei. And I'm just, this is as much as a question as a comment to Rob of why can be that the case? Is it just simply ethnic calculation, or is there something behind that?
Over to Rob.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit surprising, and to us as well, the lack of engagement, particularly at the level of the governor. And if we go back to the Pieri conference, that was effectively an opportunity for the governor to go into his community for the first time on a kind of free ticket of a great conference that had ended with a commitment to peace and so forth. And he sort of didn't take up that, to cut a long story short, didn't take up that opportunity, whereas the chief administrator was all set to jump on board. Even at the national level, there was a considerable participation ready to go. And not only did the governor's move prevent him from that dividend, he prevented everyone else from going as well because it needed his imprimatur. So it was quite a strange position to take relative to the peace process. So I don't have anything more any light to shed on that. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Rob. I believe Pauline has returned to us through the magic of her phone. Pauline, did you have anything to add that you were about to say to Rob's points previously? And after you've spoken, maybe we'll jump to the questions.
Thanks, and yes, sorry about that. My laptop suddenly couldn't reconnect again. So I'm not sure what Rob just raised, but I think just from our side and from the humanitarian side, particularly the development side, the stabilization side, I think what has been really interesting about this process, and process being, I think, the operative word here, is that what the PRE peace process has done differently from what other attempts at peacemaking in Jonglei, at least according to my own analysis, has done, is that they have really looked at strategic sequencing of activities, but also, as Rob already mentioned, strategic sequencing of engagement itself. So who do we engage, when do we engage them, and how do we bring them all together, but also recognizing that just the peace dialogue itself will never be enough, not only in the way that Rob already described, where has to be a lot of follow-up, continuous conversations, different actors being involved and then not being involved anymore, or supporting the process and then no longer supporting the process, but also, as one of the chiefs really eloquently put to me and a colleague, Chris, who's my predecessor, you can't eat a dialogue. And certainly in Jonglei, that is really important to understand. People do also need other activities to support the peace process. They really need to see the benefits of peace. And I think one of the things that's been really good about how POF and others have engaged then with the peacekeeping mission, with other humanitarians, with the ongoing trust fund projects that are happening in Jonglei, with other organizations working in Jonglei, is to look and to really try and find out a way to not just have these resolutions that will, if they are all implemented, hopefully lead to some level of peace, to really look for different organizations that will help implement those resolutions, but also to allow the community a level of agencies in deciding who they want to work with, how they work with them, to decide on which elements will actually contribute to peace and which are just elements that are also necessary or more statements. And I think that's been really important about this process. It's been an ongoing conversation and also constantly looking for ways to actually implement what is decided between the communities. Over.
Great, thanks, Pauline. So maybe we'll come to the first question, which refers to some of the things you were saying. The first question is, how has worsening food insecurity in some areas influenced different groups' willingness to engage or not engage in conflict over the past 6 months? And maybe, Rob, you want to start with that?
I'd probably flick that back to Pauline, just because
Sure.
the dynamic with food insecurity is much more where she's been on the ground in the relevant areas. So yeah, sorry, Pauline.
No problem. I don't think that worsening food insecurity impacts whether or not communities do or do not want to engage. I think what I have seen, at least from my side, but I think Rob can probably acknowledge this as well, is that generally across the communities, there has been a very large willingness to engage in whatever process at whatever level. And even kind of some of the spoilers or some of the events that we've seen over the past couple of weeks, where the Gawar led another offensive on Pibor, or at least on areas within Pibor, was not so much about the food insecurity, but rather the fact that they had, well, one of the reasons was the fact that they had felt excluded from the ongoing dialogues and the ongoing process. So I don't think it is as easy to say that food insecurity is influencing people's decisions on whether or not they want to make these. Of course, as I already said, yes, you can't eat a dialogue. Communities are realize that both food insecurity and physical insecurity need to be addressed simultaneously to really have any sustainable level of peace. In some of the areas like Nanam, for example, what we've seen as WFP is that the fact that there is no livelihood security, there is no food for the cattle keepers that are very far away from the communities where they have a level of support from others within the community, or where they have some form of coping mechanism. In those areas, it is much easier for them to use raiding as a livelihood strategy. And of course, what we really saw this year is that these continuous raids are one of the biggest threats to the ongoing peace process. So there is certainly that link there, but I don't think it really impacts it. But again, I think this brings me back to my first point, is that this entrenched inequity and isolation is what is leading to both food security and physical insecurity. And if we don't address the two simultaneously, then we can't address either of the two insecurities either.
Just to add on to that as well, in terms of the narratives through the process, one thing that's interestingly emerging, particularly on the Low Nuer side, is a lot of questioning around you need to support the Mole, which is an interesting shift as well. It's like we recognize they don't have anything, even compared to us. So there's it's just quite an interesting shift that's started to happen through some of the conversations that are going on, and also as people have seen the reality a little more on the Pibor side in relation to that. But just to underline also Pauline's point that for the armed youth, a lot of them, it's very much an economic activity as well for them as for any link to the Juba elite. And they've been very upfront about that in a lot of the discussions, that they're saying, like, you know, on the face of it, yeah, this is great, peace, but we need some evidence that there'll be some concrete dividends that we can leverage for a sustainable kind of development beyond that.
Ferry, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I also just would like to reiterate that I think and I'm talking now as a researcher, one of the under-researched parts of this conflict, and I think that's the case for it's a wider pattern in South Sudan, is understanding the local political economics, and also from the bottom to the up, and also the drivers of the conflict on the elite side of, you know, how this works. I mean, actually, what does it mean on the ground? You know, what kind of dividends they offer, what are the reasons why people go to war, what are the reasons when people say no to war, which is very interesting. But what Rob mentioned, that the spiritual leader was moving through Uror, and people were not joining him. And so I think, like, you know, combining these traditional kind of like conflict research with the research on political economy is super important.
Great, thank you, Ferry. So there's a clarificatory question for Rob here, which is going back to the violence earlier this year. Why were the Gawa Nuer not included in the PRE conference? Were they offered a position there? Did they refuse it?
To cut a long story short, it's because we stuffed it up. To go back a step, they had been part of it leading up to an earlier engagement in December in Pibor that was planned for Pibor, which was then torpedoed by the Dinka Boer politics from the Juba end. And then it was subsequently in the pre-dialogue phase leading up to PRE, it was just a major omission, which we then had an immediate follow-up from the PRE conference to go to IOD and correct it. And that, interestingly, was broadly accepted by the community. Basically, the team went and apologized and said that this was not intentional, you're fully part of the process and we want to move the process forward with you. And that was broadly accepted. But it was enough of a pretext for as part of what the attack then mobilized around, alongside some of the uncompensated attacks that had happened over the previous months, but then also these particular material interests and spiritual interests, in a way, of Makwach.
Pauline, do you have anything to add to that, or should I move to the next question?
No, I think that covers it.
Great. So the next question is for you, Pauline. I'll read it out. How do you see engaging communities in public works to provide incomes, improving infrastructure, providing skills training, forming SMEs, actually you know what they are, in the construction sector?
I'm not sure entirely what is meant by the construction sector. I guess we mean like infrastructure, roads, bridges, dikes. And I think that is exactly what we have been advocating for. So one of the interesting issues that arises in the Jonglei violence is kind of this paradox of resilience. The more resilient communities are in terms of livelihoods, which means the more cattle they have, or the better the production of sorghum during their harvests, the more actually vulnerable they are to attack, to raids, to any kind of violence, really. And which is often what leads to this idea within South Sudan that we need to focus our resilience and development activities in what people call pockets of stability or pockets of peace. And I think what we've been arguing quite strongly as World Food Programme, but also others, is that that's definitely, that doesn't help. What we need to be doing is focusing our resilience activities in the broadest sense of the word on areas that are both hotspots for conflict and hunger, like Jonglei, like Pibor, but greater Jonglei essentially. And so one of the main projects that we have designed and developed this year for Jonglei, which is funded by the RSRTF, or the Reconciliation, Stabilization, Resilience Trust Fund, is this idea where we are using a community-led process, but not just a community-led process, essentially a youth-led process, and really involving the youth that would otherwise be involved in violence, to allow them to use their agency in non-violent ways by helping make decisions around the development of their communities in terms of assets that are resilient also to conflict. It's very hard to burn down a bridge. It's very hard to burn down a road. It's very hard to burn down a watering hole, essentially. And so what we're trying to do is working with the communities in a youth-led process to understand which interventions they think would actually contribute to peace, and then also using them as the implementers of those interventions. And we do that through Food for Assets, which is kind of like food for work, but the idea being that after 3 years of developing not just these, or not doing just this community development, but also doing livelihoods activities, education. And so we're working with, for example, IOM and UNICEF on education, WHO on health. We have a lot of peace building activities through Nonviolent Peace Force. VSF is doing cattle health. So we're really trying to go across the board and have a really a program that kind of addresses all of these root causes that may come up as in these community dialogues, and addressing them all, but at the same time recognizing that these are highly food insecure communities that would otherwise be receiving food assistance, humanitarian food assistance, and all other kinds of humanitarian assistance. So they still need 3 years of food assistance essentially and this will help lift them out. And that, together with the ongoing process led by POF and their partners, hopefully will have a sustainable result after 3 years. And perhaps not, perhaps it takes us 5 or 10 years, but we do think that's a much more sustainable way of going about the conflict.
Can I jump in here with a very boring story from 1927, 100 years ago, and not saying anything against what Pauline said. I completely agree with her, and I know that what they do, they really try to do it from the bottom up. But one of the major punitive patrols against the law Nuer happened in 1927 by the colonial government, when they killed Guek Gundeng, who was the son of Gundeng Bong, the most famous law Nuer prophet. He was a prophet as well, and they tried to incorporate him to the chiefly system. As we all know, the chiefly system is mostly a British invention, especially among the law Nuer and the Dinka. So they tried to incorporate the prophet, and they made him a sub-chief, so not a paramount chief, but a smaller level chief. And then the governor went to Pieri to see the prophet and the chiefs, and he said that, okay, I want you to work on the roads. This is for the development. I just want you to contribute your people, and everything will be set. And the only person who was against the idea of building roads was the prophet. And there was an uproar by the governor that, okay, I mean, but it was called Charles Billis, that you are anti-development. And this gave a reason for the government to lead a patrol against this guy. Later killed him. Later they killed his family as well. And what I'm just saying is that what is important, I think, in these things is that this has to be done in a very conflict sensitive manner, that you know, it should be really led by the communities of what they need, and not just saying that, okay, is a road, people can come and build it. I know everyone knows this in this panel. I just wanted to say this nice story that has a lot of, I think, parallels.
Thanks,
maybe
Ferry.
also just to add to that, and I think I know Vivian is on the call, so she can speak about this much more eloquently and in detail, because this happened before my time at WFP. But something very similar to that actually what did also happen when WFP last year tried to support the construction of roads leading to Nurul and Akobo from kind of the Wat areas, where the intervention of Paul Mai, the then deputy governor of BA state, really had kind of a very negative effect in both in terms of our relationship to the community and the community's feeling of being involved or not being involved, but also with a then deputy governor kind of making a decision based on what he, well, claimed to be the best interest of his community, but what in the end turned out to be quite the opposite of that. I know Vivian is on the call, so she might want to add to this point, but I'll leave it at there.
Unfortunately, I don't think the attendees can speak. They're just a sort of silent audience, but Vivian, you can write
so perhaps she can type
the chat box, yeah, and then I'm happy to read it out, or Pauline can read it out. So just to return briefly to Ferry's comment, you can allow people to speak to her. What differs? What makes this current peace process different from those that occurred, say, in 2009, 2010 in Jonglei? Rob, I don't know if you have enough historical memory to answer that.
Not specifically in relation to the Jonglei efforts at that time, but we'd probably situate it what we perceive as being different, or what the community says is different, around firstly and particularly the direct engagement of the armed youth and the correct armed youth, so to speak. The ones who, if you go back to Ferry's tree diagrams, the sustained nature of it. So even in the comments, there's a comment about getting beyond peace conferences. For us, they're kind of milestones in an ongoing process, but it's that sustained engagement, which a lot of agencies organizationally aren't set up to resource in a way. Being able to respond immediately or close to immediately as things come up along the way in between these conference milestones. The traditional orientation, now that's been a feature before as well. So there's been elements of this that have been features before. I think something at least the process is trying to do is to bring all these dimensions together at a point where there's perhaps a particular window for them to come to some fruition. And there's some luck involved. So the fact that there was a little bit of a political vacuum to some extent for a period at the very outset of the process probably served the process. Now what we're seeing with the government coming in on particularly the Jonglei side is that particularly some of the commissioners are really useful supporters and champions for the process as well. So it's the chips have landed in really helpful ways on certain fronts as well. So there's a range of different things, but if you are conscious that all of that has been attempted before, please just shoot it all down and contradict.
I would never.
No.
Vivian, you've been given the power of speech. So if you would like to speak and respond to Pauline, you feel free to do so now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was actually typing silently, but let me try and recap. So from what I remember from last year, the complaint of the authorities in B State was really that they had not been informed before this project began. And so it was kind of like just a glitch, I think, within our internal communication, because we in the Access Unit were not aware that the project was starting. And so I kind of got the sense that it was more to do with them flexing their muscles and showing who's the authority here, rather than any other actual concern. There was a bit of a concern because the road was going through, I don't remember exactly where it was going, but it was going through or could be used from government held areas, I think, to go into IO areas. Beyond that, I don't really remember the details. Pauline, maybe you can fill out.
Pauline?
So I guess the only part of the story that I know from this year is like with having engaged with Palmai again this year as part of the PRE process, but also subsequently when I happened to be in Walgag, where last year, and quite similarly to what we are now actually facing also with Governor Denay, is that last year, and again what Palmai reiterated this year, is that what the communities had indicated to be the priority road, which was a road leading from Walgag essentially to Akobo town, was not actually in their best interest, and that rather what WFP should do is build a road up to Nero, which would be in the best interest of the community instead. Now, this led then to a semi-mobilization of the community in Akobo against the community in Nero, and that was all essentially nipped in the bud, and no road was in the end built in either direction. But I think this is something we do continue to see. For example, we've been called to account by Governor Denay quite recently, just 2 weeks ago, where we have just now finished what we call our community-based participatory planning process, which is what I already explained, where we have worked in these 3 different areas, kind of the Duk Ridge area, the Greater Akobo area, and then the lowland Pibor, where we have worked with the youth and the communities to determine what their priorities are for contributing to peace. And we kind of presented that to Governor Denay, and he informed us that those were not the priorities for peace, and that he had different priorities and that we should be doing that instead. And I think this is where it becomes quite complex, because on the one hand, of course, we can say that, well, we are taking a community-led process, but at the same time, well, as Vivian said, if the authorities feel that they are not informed or that they haven't been given a role or enough of a role, and particularly also with Denay, who hasn't really taken up his role as he could have, as Rob already very eloquently spoke about, this can make things really complex down the line. And this is something that we do need to find a way to, well, we're still looking for a way to deal with that. But it definitely can undermine the success of our project down the road.
Yeah, I think there was also security concerns, now that I remember, from their perspective, because they were questioning why we wanted to open the road down to Akobo, and we were trying to explain that we needed several different alternatives for moving food. And so I think it helped a bit to explain, but initially there was a concern from the IO National Security Wing as to why we would be doing that. So there's always those suspicions as well, and that's obviously part of the whole conflict sensitivity analysis that needs to take place before any project is implemented or planned.
Great, thank you, Vivian. So we've got 3 questions still on the docket. This one is directed to Rob. So Rob, if you could start us off, and then Pauline and Ferry, if you have anything else to add. Was there any discussion around the cost of engaging in peace spoiling activities such as cattle raiding during the PRE process? If so, what were the monitoring and accountability mechanisms agreed? And that comes with a comment. The absence of apparent costs for engaging in violence with neighboring communities is one of the factors in sustaining cycles of violence even after local peace agreements have been made. Rob.
Yeah, so it's lacking in specificity in the PRE agreements, and although there was some allusion to it, and that's part of what's created the issues that led to now this next engagement that's just continuing in Pibor, and that's actually become a focus of the engagement now in Pibor, where the Lonueras asked themselves to stay on for a further 5 days, go back to Kongor and Lakwangale to really nut out the details of this. In a more general sense, it's quite interesting, just by way of example, and this partly illustrates Ferry's point around the local political economy as well. So on the Lonuer side, there's been this recent kind of split in the armed youth leadership, where as the transition was meant to be happening from Lily and Thorbalese, they saw it very much as in their concrete material interest now to go and raid, hence this period where it looked like there could be a mobilization, because for them, the calculus was quite clear. You know, we'd given this a chance, we're not seeing dividends, now we're getting chucked out of our position, and so nothing to lose. Whereas on the flip side, the youth that were coming up were unlikely in the structure of how those dividends from raids are divided to gain a huge amount from that raid. And so what was more salient for them were the costs of raiding in the previous year, and alongside the as I said before, not being able to cultivate, as well as the potential of setting up a more sort of solid foundation for development. But they've said, you know, we're only going to let, and this links with a question a little lower, I think, we're only going to give them so long because we're not going to tolerate these sporadic attacks forever. So in the narrative on the Lone Aware side, the can's been kicked down the road to about December, but not necessarily more than that. But it's another conversation also we're trying to engage them in to understand, you know, what is the usual return, if you like, on the raids that you have. And so to get a clearer sense of what the incentives need to be like in the broadest possible sense to disincentivize raiding. I mean, it's a critical question. And in the PRE conference itself is a whole other story as to how that got sidetracked away from some of the more concrete points onto the more ritual component, but that's for another day.
Thanks, Rob. Maybe I'll ask the last question, and that, as you said, you sort of anticipated it somewhat, which is, what is the positioning of the Low as regards to the persistent cattle raiding attributed to Merle and Uror and Nirol over the past weeks and months? Was this discussed during the discussions in PBOR? Do they still receive assurances from the Merle about returning their cattle and arresting the perpetrators?
Yes. So there, with the exception of the outgoing armed youth leaders, and so there was a concrete attempt at mobilization, basically, led by Lily and Thorbalise and supported by Dakweth, which is one of the great disappointments of the process. That failed because the community at large was determined to continue this process. And again, I would just mention the dividends of the return of abductees. And I don't mean that in a token sense. I mean that in a really, like, it seems to have had a profound and unexpected impact on the communities and the hope that they derive from that in relation to a more sustainable process, which is interesting. And the cattle and the perpetrators, yeah, so there was a whole abortive attempt, which then got finally undermined by the Goa attack for the return of cattle. And that's what the Lone Aware partly are sticking around for, to sort out the details of that. But it's interesting because even in the miscommunications around that, one of our team was able to take photos of the cattle and show them to some of the people in Pierre. And as soon as they saw their cattle, they were like, okay, as long as it's there, we'll give them the time that they need to bring them back. But they needed that reassurance. Again, comes back to this point about open channels between the groups. And just very quickly to that point, that was something that the former chief administrator was excellent at in communicating directly. He wasn't protocol bound in his approach and communicated directly with commissioners and paramount chiefs on the Lone Aware side. And that helped stay off a full mobilization as well up to this point. But it's never a sure bet, is always the caveat to all of this.
Pauline or Ferry, do you have anything to add to that?
I maybe have just two small points. And I think the first one being about the cost of the ongoing raids and the cost of the ongoing rights. I guess both points go to that. I think one, I mean, as much as we all say, and as much as in the ongoing dialogues, it keeps coming back as one of the key points, the fact that ongoing raids will undermine the longer term process. One of the things that came out really clearly in our kind of community-based planning, so not the political process that is the theory process, but really talking with the communities themselves, is that they don't necessarily see raiding, just the kind of the old school raiding, if you will. They don't necessarily see that as undermining the peace process. In fact, exactly as Rob said, like when we asked them, like one of the key aspects of kind of designing this project is how will we measure contributions to peace? And so we really are trying to take a very community-focused approach to that, like how do they measure increased security, increased peace, etc. And one of the things that came back time after time was the return of abductees. A halt in all raiding activities wasn't ever mentioned as that will prove to them that there is now peace in Jonglei. In fact, in quite a few of the communities, certainly in kind of greater Akobo, but also in the Congolese areas that border on Akobo, communities kept raising the fact that, and we know this, I mean, the research points this out very clearly, is that raiding and revenge attacks, I mean, we always see this as kind of the cycles of revenge, and that's really bad. But we fail to recognize that revenge, the concept of revenge also generally historically managed to keep conflicts from escalating out of proportion, because raids would be proportionate to a previous raid, and kind of the cycle of revenge would always stay proportionate, with communities knowing fully well that if they conduct a disproportionate raid on their neighboring community, that would lead to a mass mobilization. It kind of kept the conflict from ever escalating into what we saw in 2020. And communities are cognizant of that, and they don't necessarily see that as meaning that the peace process itself has failed. So that's the first point I think that we should keep in mind, and we shouldn't always think that, oh, if the Morley continue to raid, then therefore they're not interested in peace. And I think what's really interesting is that the low Nuer youth also fully recognize that. They also see that not so much as people being against the process, but just that this is a system that they have to deal with. Now, the other thing about the cost of conflict, or the cost of not adhering to the peace process, this is where things also get quite complex. And certainly, as a WFP, we saw that when during the Pieri process, the paramount chiefs of some of the areas in the Olan Pibor requested certain new final distribution points for food assistance from WFP. And these areas are generally in far away pasture areas, like in the border areas of Nanam, but also in Malaktoch, which is kind of more in the south, in the Tilla Plain. And when we acknowledge that these are areas that we don't reach, and we wanted to go do an assessment on trying to figure out who's there, how many people are there, who are we actually not reaching. And at the same time, we saw this increase kind of in raids into the Duk, Ayod areas, but also into Uror. The process of the return of the cattle had slowed down because of a variety of reasons. And so the situation in Nanam got increasingly tense, which meant that we couldn't get in there in time before the rain started. And we had very frank conversations with the communities, but also with the chiefs, with the representatives about that. And they recognize this. They recognize very much that if violence breaks out again in these areas, then all these projects that have been set up since the 2020 violence will come to a halt, and they themselves will suffer as a result of it. It's not that their neighbors will suffer, they themselves will suffer the results. Similarly, in the low Nuer areas, when kind of these risks increased of mobilization after Lili had lost his position as the head of the White Army, these communities were fully aware that if they mobilize then, that would be during the planting season, and mobilizing during the planting season will likely mean another year of food insecurity because there will be no harvest. And I think it's the communities do have a lot of agency in making these decisions, but unfortunately, as development agencies, as currently the agencies that do bring kind of the benefits of the peace, if you will, because we have now the operational space to do so, we also cannot blame the communities or somehow blame have a collective punishment by pulling out because certain elements of that community is mobilizing against another. And so it's a very fine line of figuring out how do we continue engaging, even if communities don't contribute to peace. Of course, when there's like what we saw with the Gawara attack, everyone had to pull out for security reasons. That's one thing, but pulling out almost as a result of communities not adhering to the peace process is a slippery slope.
Thank you, Pauline. We are coming to the end of the webinar. I just asked Rob if he has any final thoughts, and then I'll pass it over to Ferry. Rob?
Just two quick things. The one was that there was a point in one of the boxes that comes up on these things about diaspora, and that they played a significant role in last year's conflict as well in terms of financing, and the person mentioned the hate speech and so forth online. So there's probably a separate conversation also to have around that. And then just the final element that we haven't really touched on so much in relation to the peace process is the intra-Dinka, intra-Morley divisions and how they interact with the dynamic of the inter-communal peace process. So and that's all in its own way hugely significant too. But yeah, there's a limit to what we can cover. But full stop.
Thanks, Rob. Ferry, do you want to say some passing words?
Yes, thanks everyone. I think it was an excellent panel. I really learned a lot, and thanks everyone for joining. A few things that came to my mind. These are not refined thoughts, just something that came to my mind is that what I was thinking when Rob and Pauline discussed the intra-Luo-Nuer issues with leadership ousted, trying to mobilize, then it failed. It shows in a sense how, and that's my fieldwork is also showing that when I spend time in Akobo, is the deeply, and I use this word maybe incorrectly, but the deeply democratic nature of the Luo-Nuer White Army. That even though the two leaders decide what will happen, there's still a consensus needs to be reached for all the sections, for all the chapters of the White Army. And if they do not agree, then this will not happen. And this is what we had seen. And I think that's amazing. And I think that's a thing that needs to be researched further. To me, it's an amazing takeaway. There was a question about the online hate speech and the effects of that, which Rob rightly said that that's a whole other discussion. What is interesting, my research that I conducted among the 3 communities for the Human Rights Division for Small Arms Survey, is that there is a lot of misunderstanding within the communities about the other community. I mean, when I asked about, for example, bride wealth, how much you pay for a wife, how much you have to pay, and does it have a reason for you to go to fighting? And most communities said no, that's not an issue. It's fairly easy to get married. You collect 30-40 cattle, but the Murle are coming to attack us because they need 150 to get married. And then the Murle said that, okay, but the Luo-Nuer, they really need 200 cattle to get married, and that's why they're coming for us. And it was an amazing thing that they think about the neighbors, and that's another element that we have to look into. And just the third point is that this entire thing of collecting the local with the national level politics is super interesting, and I'm really engaged. I'm really looking forward for further conversations. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, Vivian. Thanks everyone for joining. I pass it back to Christopher and Joshua.
Yeah, thank you all. We'll see you for the next webinar, which has a subject yet to be determined, but may well be the restructuring.
We have a subject
of the SSPDF. Yeah, go on.
The subject will be the arms embargo and the benchmarks of the arms embargo and how that will how that can be measured and stuff like that. But maybe Christopher can tell more about that.
Great.
Yes, thanks. Big thanks to today's panelists, Ferry, Rob, and especially Pauline for joining us despite being on the move, and Joshua for your excellent moderating. I hope that we can bring you all back together again down the line and provide some additional insights into what we all hope are solid achievements in reducing violence in Jonglei. So we will see when we can do that again. Another thanks to everybody for your questions and for attending today. Please look out for future activities in your inbox. And as Ferry mentioned, we are putting together a webinar around the embargo. So that's upcoming, in details out to you very shortly. In the meantime, please let us know if you have any questions in relation to the data on the MAAPSS website. We're always happy to receive questions and to respond to those questions. So please let us know. Until then, be well, keep safe, and good evening from Nairobi. That's it for me.